In the summer of 1923, construction workers renovating the basement of the Pemberton Club on Gold Street in Lower Manhattan made a discovery that would send shockwaves through the highest levels of American government. Hidden behind a false wall, they found a chamber containing detailed records of what federal investigators would later classify as the most systematic campaign of terror against the poor ever documented on American soil. The documents, written in meticulous handwriting and bound in leather volumes, revealed the existence of a secret society called the Gold Street Circle. For over 30 years, from 1889 to 1920, this organization had conducted what they euphemistically termed population management exercises, targeting the homeless, immigrants, and destitute residents of New York City's Lower East Side. What they were actually doing was hunting human beings for sport. The discovery was immediately classified by the Bureau of Investigation, the predecessor to the FBI, and the files were sealed under national security provisions. For nearly a century, the full extent of the Gold Street Circle's activities has remained buried in government archives, too explosive for public consumption and too politically damaging to acknowledge. The wealthy families involved included names that still grace museum wings and university buildings across America today. But recently declassified documents, obtained through decades of legal battles by investigative journalist Margaret Chen, have finally revealed the complete scope of this organized campaign of murder that claimed hundreds of lives in the name of what the perpetrators called social Darwinism in action. The Gold Street Circle began in the winter of 1889, founded by a group of 7 extremely wealthy New York businessmen who had grown increasingly disturbed by what they viewed as the deteriorating quality of the city's population. The massive waves of immigration from Eastern and Southern Europe, combined with the growing numbers of homeless veterans from the Civil War, had created what they saw as a dangerous underclass that threatened the purity of American society. The founding members included railroad magnate Harrison Blackwood, steel baron Vincent Rothschild, banking heir Charles Pemberton, textile manufacturer Augustus Sterling, shipping tycoon Theodore Whitman, real estate developer Marcus Goldman, and pharmaceutical fortune heir Dr. Edmund Hartwell. Each controlled vast industrial empires and possessed the kind of generational wealth that provided complete insulation from legal consequences. These men had been meeting informally for years at the exclusive Pemberton Club, discussing their shared concerns about urban decay and social degeneracy. But it was Dr. Hartwell who proposed the solution that would transform their gentlemen's discussions into systematic murder. Drawing on his medical background and his fascination with emerging theories of eugenics, Hartwell argued that society's problems could only be solved through direct intervention to eliminate what he called genetic defectives. The idea evolved gradually through a series of increasingly extreme proposals. Initially, they discussed funding deportation programs or establishing work camps in remote areas. But Hartwell's influence pushed the group toward more radical solutions, arguing that mere removal was insufficient because the defective elements would simply reproduce elsewhere and eventually return to contaminate the gene pool. The breakthrough came when Blackwood proposed framing their activities as a form of scientific research, combined with recreational hunting. He had spent years organizing elaborate hunting expeditions for rare game in Africa and South America, and he suggested applying the same organizational principles to what he termed the most dangerous game of all. This approach would allow them to pursue their eugenic goals while providing the excitement and challenge that their privileged lives otherwise lacked. The first exercise was conducted in March 1890, targeting a group of homeless veterans who had established a makeshift camp in a warehouse district near the East River. The operation was planned with military precision, using techniques that Blackwood had learned from his big game hunting expeditions. The 7 founders, armed with custom-made rifles and assisted by hired trackers, surrounded the encampment in the early morning hours and systematically eliminated 12 men. The bodies were disposed of using a crematory facility owned by one of Sterling's textile companies, and the deaths were never reported to authorities. The victims had no families, no fixed addresses, and no documentation that would make their disappearance noticeable to the broader community. They had been selected specifically because they could vanish without creating any official investigation. The psychological impact of this first kill was profound and immediate. The participants described experiencing a level of excitement and satisfaction that exceeded anything they had felt in their previous hunting experiences. Dr. Hartwell meticulously documented the physiological and emotional responses of each participant, creating detailed records that would later reveal the addictive nature of their activities. More importantly, the success of the operation convinced the group that they had discovered the perfect solution to their social concerns. They could eliminate undesirable population elements while experiencing unprecedented thrills, all without risking exposure or legal consequences. The combination of ideological justification and recreational excitement proved irresistible. Over the following months, the Gold Street Circle refined their techniques and expanded their operations. They developed sophisticated surveillance methods for identifying potential targets, using private investigators and paid informants to map the movements and habits of homeless populations throughout Lower Manhattan. They established safe houses where weapons could be stored and operations could be planned without detection. Most crucially, they created an elaborate system for documenting their activities. Each hunt was recorded in detail, with careful notes on tactics used, weapons employed, and the performance of individual participants. Photographs were taken of notable kills, and trophies were collected from victims. These records were maintained with the same obsessive attention to detail that characterized their business operations. The selection criteria for targets became increasingly sophisticated as the organization matured. Initially, they focused on obvious candidates like homeless veterans and street dwellers, but as their confidence grew, they began targeting recent immigrants who had not yet established community connections, mentally ill individuals who had been abandoned by their families, and eventually entire families who had fallen into destitution. The hunts themselves evolved into elaborate theatrical productions that combined the excitement of pursuit with careful attention to what the participants called sporting fairness. Targets were sometimes given advance warning or provided with crude weapons to make the chase more challenging. Hunts were conducted in various locations throughout the city, from abandoned buildings in industrial districts to the more remote areas of Central Park during construction phases. Dr. Hartwell's role as the group's intellectual leader became increasingly important as their activities expanded. He developed detailed theories about the genetic characteristics that made certain populations suitable for elimination, creating classification systems that allowed the group to rationalize their victim selection process. His medical training also proved invaluable in developing methods for disposing of bodies and eliminating physical evidence. The psychological conditioning necessary to transform wealthy businessmen into systematic killers required careful cultivation. Hartwell organized what he called desensitization exercises that gradually escalated participants' comfort level with violence. These began with the torture of animals and progressed through increasingly brutal treatment of captured victims before final elimination. The group also developed elaborate rituals and ceremonies that reinforced their sense of purpose and group cohesion. Each successful hunt was followed by a formal dinner at the Pemberton Club, where participants would share detailed accounts of their experiences and plan future operations. These gatherings served both to maintain group loyalty and to reinforce the ideological framework that justified their activities. By 1895, the Gold Street Circle had evolved into a sophisticated killing organization with established protocols, specialized equipment, and a growing membership. The original 7 founders had recruited additional participants from their social circles, expanding the group to include prominent figures from banking, manufacturing, and politics. Each new member was carefully vetted and required to participate in increasingly serious criminal activities before being granted full membership status. The expansion brought new resources and capabilities to the organization. Political connections provided advance warning of police investigations and ensured that any inconvenient discoveries would be quietly suppressed. Business relationships allowed for the acquisition of specialized equipment and the establishment of additional facilities for planning and disposal operations. Most importantly, the growing membership created internal pressure for more frequent and elaborate hunting expeditions. What had begun as occasional recreational activities evolved into regular campaigns that targeted dozens of victims per year. The competitive dynamics between members drove them to seek increasingly challenging prey and more creative killing methods. The peak period of Gold Street Circle activities occurred between 1895 and 1905, when their operations reached industrial scale. During this decade, the organization was responsible for the systematic elimination of hundreds of New York's most vulnerable residents. Their activities expanded beyond simple hunting to include elaborate psychological experiments designed to study human behavior under extreme stress. Some of their most disturbing operations involved the capture and imprisonment of entire families in specially constructed facilities. These victims were subjected to various forms of physical and psychological torture, while detailed observations were recorded by Dr. Hartwell and his assistants. The stated purpose was to gather scientific data about pain tolerance and survival instincts across different ethnic and social groups. The organization also began conducting what they called breeding experiments, involving the systematic rape and forced pregnancy of captured women. The resulting children were studied to determine whether environmental factors could overcome what the Circle believed were inferior genetic characteristics. Most of these infants were killed shortly after birth, though some were kept alive for extended observation periods. These expanded activities required increasingly sophisticated infrastructure. The Circle established multiple facilities throughout the city, including holding areas for captured victims, torture chambers equipped with the latest medical instruments, and disposal facilities capable of eliminating large numbers of bodies without detection. They also developed networks of corrupt officials and hired criminals who could provide logistical support for their operations. The psychological impact of sustained participation in these activities was carefully documented by Dr. Hartwell, who was fascinated by what he termed the evolution of the predatory instinct in civilized men. His records reveal the gradual transformation of the participants from reluctant killers motivated primarily by ideology to enthusiastic sadists who derived genuine pleasure from inflicting suffering. Several members developed elaborate personal rituals around their killing activities, creating collections of trophies taken from victims and developing signature methods of torture that became their trademarks within the organization. The competitive aspects of membership drove participants to seek increasingly creative and brutal approaches to victim elimination. The beginning of the end for the Gold Street Circle came in 1906, when one of their operations went catastrophically wrong. During a hunt in the Warehouse district near Brooklyn Bridge, a group of targets managed to escape and reach police before they could be recaptured. The survivors' testimony provided authorities with detailed descriptions of the attackers and specific information about their methods and equipment. The initial police investigation was quickly suppressed through political pressure and financial influence. However, the incident had created too much evidence and involved too many witnesses to be completely contained. Several reform-minded police detectives began conducting unauthorized investigations, and newspaper reporters started asking uncomfortable questions about the unusual number of disappearances in certain neighborhoods. More problematically for the Circle, the failed hunt had shaken the confidence of several members who began questioning whether the risks of continued activities outweighed the benefits. The organization's unity, which had been maintained through careful psychological conditioning and mutual complicity, began to fracture as individual members started prioritizing their personal safety over group loyalty. Dr. Hartwell's response to these pressures was to propose an escalation of activities that would eliminate any potential witnesses and demonstrate the organization's continued power. He suggested conducting a series of mass elimination events that would target entire communities and create sufficient terror to prevent any future cooperation with authorities. This proposal triggered the final crisis within the Gold Street Circle. Several founding members, led by Charles Pemberton, argued that such extreme measures would inevitably lead to exposure and prosecution. The debate that followed revealed fundamental disagreements about the organization's goals and methods that had been suppressed during their years of successful operations. The conflict came to a head during a meeting at the Pemberton Club in December 1906, when Dr. Hartwell accused the moderate faction of cowardice and threatened to expose their previous activities unless they supported his escalation plans. The confrontation became violent, resulting in Hartwell's death and the permanent dissolution of the organization as a unified entity. The remaining members agreed to cease all hunting activities and focus on eliminating evidence of their previous crimes. Over the following months, they systematically destroyed facilities, eliminated potential witnesses, and used their political connections to ensure that any ongoing investigations would be terminated. The official records of hundreds of murders were permanently expunged from police files. However, the meticulous documentation habits that had characterized their operations during the peak years made complete evidence elimination impossible. The detailed records that Dr. Hartwell had maintained were too extensive and too well hidden to be completely located and destroyed. These documents remained concealed in the secret chamber beneath the Pemberton Club, waiting to be discovered 17 years later. The psychological aftermath of their years of systematic killing had profound effects on the surviving members. Several suffered what contemporary physicians termed nervous breakdowns that required extended stays in private sanitariums. Others developed elaborate paranoid delusions about potential exposure and spent their remaining years in self-imposed isolation. Most adapted by channeling their predatory instincts into legal but equally destructive business practices. The industrial empires they controlled became notorious for their brutal treatment of workers and their systematic exploitation of immigrant labor. The same psychological patterns that had driven their hunting activities were redirected toward economic warfare against the poor. The discovery of the hidden chamber in 1923 created immediate panic among the surviving members and their descendants. Several families used their political influence to ensure that the investigation remained classified, while others employed private security firms to eliminate potential witnesses who might have seen the documents before they were officially seized. The federal investigation that followed was hampered by the advanced age or death of most potential suspects and the destruction of corroborating evidence during the dissolution period. However, the recovered documents provided sufficient detail to reconstruct the full scope of the Circle's activities and identify the specific individuals responsible for hundreds of murders. The political implications of prosecution were deemed too severe to pursue. The families involved controlled major industrial enterprises that employed hundreds of thousands of workers, and their financial influence extended throughout the banking and political systems. A public trial would have exposed the complicity of numerous officials and potentially destabilized the entire economic structure of New York City. Instead, a secret agreement was reached that required the surviving families to provide financial compensation to be distributed among immigrant and poverty assistance programs. The amounts involved were substantial enough to fund social services for decades, but they were structured to appear as routine charitable donations rather than legal settlements. The cover-up was so complete that no public acknowledgement of the Gold Street Circle's existence appeared in any official records. The families involved continued to be celebrated as philanthropists and civic leaders, with their charitable foundations receiving praise for their support of exactly the populations they had once systematically hunted. The recently declassified documents reveal that the federal government continued monitoring the families involved for several more decades, concerned that the psychological patterns that had driven their systematic killing might resurface in subsequent generations. These surveillance files document numerous suspicious incidents involving family members, including several unexplained disappearances of employees and business associates. The psychological profiles developed by government analysts suggest that the hunting activities had created addictive behavioral patterns that persisted long after the formal dissolution of the organization. Several family members were suspected of continuing individual killing activities, though the evidence was never sufficient to support prosecution. The most disturbing aspect of the declassified materials is the revelation that similar organizations may have operated in other major cities during the same period. References in the Circle's correspondence suggest coordination with comparable groups in Chicago, Philadelphia, and Boston, indicating that the systematic hunting of the poor might have been a nationwide phenomenon among America's wealthy elite. The legacy of the Gold Street Circle extends far beyond their direct victims. The psychological trauma inflicted on immigrant communities created lasting patterns of distrust toward authorities and established institutions that persisted for generations. The knowledge that the wealthy could literally hunt the poor with impunity reinforced social divisions that continue to shape American society. More broadly, the case demonstrates the extent to which extreme wealth can provide insulation from legal and moral consequences. The Circle's members were able to commit hundreds of murders over multiple decades without facing any meaningful accountability, protected by their financial resources and political connections from any form of justice. The families descended from the Circle's membership continue to wield enormous influence in American society. Their foundations fund major universities, hospitals, and cultural institutions, while their business empires control significant portions of the national economy. The charitable work for which they receive public praise serves as a form of historical laundering that obscures their ancestors' systematic campaign of terror against the poor. The complete records of the Gold Street Circle remain classified under provisions that protect both national security interests and individual privacy rights. The few researchers who have gained access to portions of the files describe them as providing the most detailed documentation of systematic murder by private citizens in American history. The psychological insights they contain have influenced federal approaches to investigating organized violence and understanding the behavioral patterns of serial killers. The story of the Gold Street Circle serves as a reminder that the most dangerous predators in human society are often those with the resources and social position to operate beyond the reach of normal legal constraints. Their victims were selected not randomly, but systematically, chosen specifically because their deaths would not be investigated or mourned by broader society. In the shadows of America's Gilded Age, while the public celebrated the philanthropic achievements of industrial titans, a secret war was being waged against the most vulnerable members of society. The weapons were custom-made rifles, the battlefield was the streets of Lower Manhattan, and the enemy was anyone whose poverty made them invisible to official protection. The Gold Street Circle represents the ultimate expression of social Darwinism taken to its logical conclusion, where the wealthy did not simply allow the poor to die through neglect or exploitation, but actively hunted them for entertainment. Their legacy lives on in the institutional structures they created and the wealth they accumulated, hidden behind charitable facades that honor the memory of systematic killers as beloved philanthropists. What other secrets might be buried in the foundations of America's great fortunes? How many other hunting societies operated in the shadows of respectability, turning human misery into recreational sport? The complete truth about the Gold Street Circle may never be fully revealed, but their story serves as a chilling reminder of what becomes possible when wealth, power and twisted ideology combine without accountability or moral restraint.